guys, and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to wish everybody a happy holidays if you celebrate anything, or just a wonderful winter season if you don't. Today I'm recording on the 28th of December and it is a wonderfully rainy day, so I have myself parked here right in front of my giant window so I can look outside and see the rain while I record. And even though there are still technically a few more days left in the month for me to reach my reading goal, I wanted to make sure that I was able to record this video in time to get it out for the 1st of January. I had set my reading goal for 50 books for the year, but because I only started reading in August, it ended up being 5 months to read 50 books, which works out to obviously 10 books a month, and that didn't really work out for me. So this month I was saddled with reading 12 books, which is much more than I typically read, so it was a bit of a struggle for me. I don't enjoy pushing myself to have to read when I don't really want to, but I really had to cram in the books for this month to get through the challenge. So I have officially read 12 books for the month, and now I'm gonna go through them with you guys. So the very first book that I read this month was actually a library book that I don't have with me anymore. Unfortunately, I had to return it like 2 days after I read it, but it's The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and I gave the book 5 stars. The Song of Achilles actually follows the perspective of Patroclus, who is Achilles' lover. We follow their story from when Patroclus is young to when they first meet and when they are older and going through the Trojan War, the 10-year-long Trojan War that is featured in the Odyssey, I believe. Now, I'm not actually super familiar with the Iliad or the Odyssey because I actually didn't read them in high school, which is when I think most people read them. So I'm not super familiar with the stories or the characters in them or anything like that. But I will say that I did read the author's note at the end of the book, and I really appreciated the fact that Madeline Miller took 10 years to write this book. Like, she went and did so much research and just absolutely lived and breathed these books to create this book out of that. I do think that this story itself was absolutely beautifully written. She has some of the most beautiful writing I think I've ever read, and the characters just came off the pages. They felt really, really authentic, and I pretty much loved everything about it. Now, there is a trigger warning for rape that I want to mention. It is not a huge part of the book, but it does come up a few times, enough that I would be uncomfortable recommending it to anybody who would be triggered by such a topic. So if that does bother you, I absolutely would not recommend this book. Something that I don't think I will ever get over with this book is how Madeline Miller managed to take Patroclus, who is the main character of this story, the character that we are following from his perspective the entire story and his life. She manages to write him as almost a secondary character, and in the best way possible. I didn't even know that there was a good way to do that, but she has just absolutely blown my mind. Like, it makes sense when you read the story and you understand that in Patroclus's real life, he actually is like a secondary character to Achilles. He always puts Achilles first, and he loves him so much, and he has such a special connection with him that the most important thing in his life is Achilles. And that's not to say that Patroclus is an underwritten character or that he's not well developed or anything like that. He is absolutely his own character in his own right, but somehow he has managed to be written as the side character to Achilles' life. And I appreciate that so much because it didn't make me like Patroclus less or Achilles more or anything like that. I respected them individually as characters and as people so much more, I think, because of that, because I was able to see a very clear dynamic between the two of them. I don't think that I have ever seen or felt a stronger bond or connection between two characters as I have with Patroclus and Achilles. This book is literally the book that made me understand what people mean when they say that they would give up their soul to read the book again for the first time. Like, I've enjoyed tons of books in the past. I have so many books that I hold dear to my heart, but this is one book that was so beautifully written and the experience was so wonderful from start to finish that I feel like I will never be able to get back what I felt reading it the first time, discovering this entire story and the characters and the world for the first time, as I will in the future when I reread it. So I loved this story. I recommend it to everybody as long as they are aware of the trigger warning that I mentioned earlier. The next book that I read after A Song of Achilles was Enchante by Guida Trelise, and I gave this book a 3.5 stars. In this story, we follow a 17-year-old girl named Camille who is living in Paris during the French Revolution, and their world is similar to ours. The only real difference is that they have some magical realism in it. So they do have a magic system, but aside from that, pretty much everything else is the same. So at the beginning of this story, we are told that Camille's parents both died of small smallpox before the story begins, and so she is orphaned with her older brother and her younger sister, and she is actually the one left to take care of them because her older brother is a drunkard and absolutely useless and abusive, and her younger sister is frail and sick and needs to be taken care of, and Camille is the only one that actually has the ability to use magic. And the magic that she's able to do is very kind of small scale. It's transforming things, but very small things. So basically she's able to turn scraps into fake coins, but they always come back to their natural state. So it's not safe for her to use fake currency very often when she lives in kind of a small neighborhood. And the rest of the story follows Camille as she learns more about her magical abilities and figures out ways to use them to basically secure a safe future for her and her family. Now, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of magical realism because it just takes what is our essentially ordinary world and adds bits of magic to it. So if it's done well, I'll definitely enjoy it. But this book, I feel like, kind of failed in that aspect because the magic system was not very clear and I felt like there were a lot of holes in it. And so it left me wondering if it was just bad writing on the author's part, or if we weren't really seeing a clear picture because the character herself didn't really know anything about magic either. And so she was kind of picking things up and learning as she was going, and therefore so were we. But even at the end, like, nothing really made sense. I felt like there were a lot of gaps in the reasoning for things. So I was definitely disappointed by the magic system. Originally, I was actually planning on giving this book a 4. I did enjoy it quite a bit up until about the halfway point. Then it started meandering and getting kind of repetitious and boring. And so then it dropped down to a 3.5 and eventually a 3 when the main antagonist, who you think is this really intimidating, scary character, he has this kind of mysterious aura about him. We don't know that much about him. And that adds to, I guess, the intimidation of his character. And then at the end of the story, he literally explains all of his reasoning for things. And it's just so dumb. And I just didn't believe it. It felt so inauthentic to the character to be explaining his reasons away like a cartoon villain from a kids show. So at that, I dropped it down to a 3. And the ending, as I finished the book, it wasn't spectacular in any way to make it come back up to 3.5. I just settled on a 3.5 at the end because I decided that even though there were a lot of ups and downs with this book, a lot of aspects that I did enjoy and did not enjoy, overall, I liked it more than just a base 3, so I ended up giving it a 3.5. I gotta say though, I am just a little bit confused because apparently there's gonna be a sequel to this book, and if you guys have read this book, the way that it ends, I don't feel like a second book is necessary at all. Like, I truly don't understand the reason why, other than just a cash grab, I guess. So while I did enjoy this book enough that I gave it a 3.5 in the end, and I definitely can see myself rereading it in the future and even buying my own copy, I absolutely have no interest in reading the second book or if there's a third one or anything like that because it just feels really unnecessary. The next 2 books that I read are actually books that I've kind of had on my TBR for a long time. They were books that I heard a lot about when I first joined the book community, and I heard a lot of people talking about these books, but since then I feel like nobody has talked about them, and it's probably because they're a little bit older and I don't know, I guess the fan base just isn't there anymore. But it's The Wrath and the Dawn and The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Ahdieh. Now, these are the very first books by Renee Ahdieh I have ever read. I do have quite a few of her books on my TBR that I absolutely am excited to read. So for The Wrath and the Dawn, I gave this book a 4.5 stars out of 5. So I think you can tell that I really, really enjoyed this story. I didn't absolutely love it. Like, it isn't top tier for me, which is why I didn't give it a 5 stars, but it was very, very close. I enjoyed so much of this book. So in this book, we follow Shahrazad, who I think is about 17 years old, and in the city of Khorasan where she lives, the caliph is an 18-year-old boy named Khalid. Khalid takes a new wife every single day, and the next morning at dawn, the wife is killed, and so the cycle continues that way until Shahrazad's best friend is actually the next chosen Khalifa, and she's killed before the story begins, which prompts Shahrazad to come up with a plan to kill the caliph and volunteers herself to be the next Khalifa. And somehow she ends up being the first woman to break the cycle and live for more than one day. And so we're we're following the story between her and Khalid. Basically, this is a romance story between the two of them. And I was a little hesitant at first going into it, knowing that it was probably going to be a little bit problematic when you have someone who is kind of an evil dictator who is murdering these innocent girls and the main character who is clearly bound to fall in love with him. But I felt like it was done pretty well, in my opinion. I know that it definitely still had some problematic elements, but I feel like overall the romance between them, the way that their relationship developed, and obviously the reasons for why he does what he does and all of that, it made sense to me. And I actually am a big fan of Khalid. I know that kind of sounds crazy if you've never read this book and you're just like, what? He's like a murderous dictator. And I'm like, no, but he is, but he's not. Basically, I just really love when the male or masculine character is like a simp for the female character. I can't get enough of it. Like, numerous times he shows truly how much he loves her, especially towards the end, and it makes me feel fuzzy inside. So I was definitely rooting for them. I am really sad to say that I haven't been able to find any good fan art of them, because I would for sure love to collect fan art of this couple, because they're some of my favorites, I think, at this point. Like, they're kind of up there, because Shahrazad is so incredible as a character alone. Like, she is so independent, she's so strong-willed, she truly believes in herself, she loves herself, and I love a character that does that. Despite what you may think about her having this relationship with this character, I have to say that her alone, she is just incredible. And when they're together, I feel like they're just this dynamic power couple. Something that I didn't really expect going into this book was how much the idea of gray morality kind of gets tossed around. For a lot of YA fantasy books, it tends to be pretty black and white with what's good and what's not, who's good and who's bad. But for this story, it is so much about the gray space in between, and I really enjoyed that. Now, as for the second book, I gave it a 4 stars out of 5. I feel like I've kind of had this trend lately where I enjoy sequels to books almost more than the original books, because usually the stories progress more and it gets more exciting and interesting and we get to know more of the characters' histories and stuff. But for me, actually, I like this one quite a bit less than the last one. I still gave it a 4 because I thought it was great. I was pretty bored and uninterested for a good portion of it, but the ending really drew me back in with that 4. I felt like it tied off really well. I was really happy and satisfied with everything that happened. But I would say for the first like half of this book, I was definitely a little bit uninterested, and that's mainly because the reason why I loved the first book so much was because of Shahrazad and Khalid's relationship, and the second book actually follows directly after, when she is forced to leave him and has to stay with an encampment outside of the city with people who hate him. And so we're constantly thrown into situations where she's forced to listen to people talk about how disgusting and horrible he is as a person, and it just like is very infuriating in that way for so much of the book that I was for sure gonna give it a 3 originally. But like I said, things really picked up towards the end. I was really happy with the direction that things went in the end, which led to the 4. There was also one scene that kind of made me laugh after I read it, because the first thing that came to mind was a Twilight reference. For any Twilight fans out there, you guys are gonna know what scene I'm talking about. But there is a scene in Twilight where Edward and Jacob are in a tent in the mountains to protect Bella. Up until that point, they've both been resentful and hated each other, even though they've handled it in different ways. And that is the night that they kind of have a conversation between them as love rivals for Bella. And there's a scene between Khalid and Tariq that is somewhat similar, that as soon as I finished reading that scene, I was like, Twilight. So yes, overall, I would say I definitely enjoyed both of these books. This one significantly more, but I definitely plan on owning these two in the future. I was a little hesitant if I was really gonna enjoy the story or not after hearing mixed reviews, and that's why I wanted to borrow it from the library first, but now I can't wait to have my own copy and go through them again. I don't know if you guys can actually hear the rain in the background, because it started raining again, like kind of heavily, but if you can, I hope you enjoy it, because I personally love the sound of rain. Anyway, the next book that I read was The Afterlife of Holly Chase by Cynthia Hand. So I was super excited to get into it, because not only is it a Christmas book that I can read in December, but the premise also sounded really interesting. Like, it's a very interesting twist on the original Christmas Carol story. So I was really stoked when I saw that my library had this this available, and I ended up giving it a 3.5 stars out of 5. Now, in this story, we follow Holly Chase, obviously, who is a 16-year-old socialite. Her father is a very famous and rich director, and she lives a very comfortable life in Malibu, where she is constantly flaunting her status and her wealth, and she treats everybody else like dirt. So when she ends up being visited by the ghosts of Christmas pasts, she ends up not taking the opportunity that they give her, and she ends up dying a year later and becomes a member of the Christmas Past team. In fact, she becomes Christmas Past itself. So for the rest of the story, we are following her as she is doing her job. She literally works at like a corporate office doing this job year round, planning and preparing for her role as a Christmas ghost on Christmas Day every year. So in this book, we follow her after she's been doing this for 5 years. She's pretty much a pro at this, but her personality has not gotten that much better. She isn't the worst person, but she's definitely not a good person. And things are pretty boring and standard in her life now that she is technically dead, but not dead. Holly is literally the embodiment of that meme, like, I'm dead, but I'm alive.
I feel like I'm dead. I'm alive, but I'm dead.
That's literally her. So the main thing that I enjoyed about this book was just that it was such a creative and unique twist on The Christmas Carol. Again, it wasn't an absolutely perfect story. I didn't like some aspects of it. I feel like some people would have had a problem with the way that the book ended because it wasn't necessarily your very typical fairy tale ending, but I personally enjoyed it. I thought it was great. And now all I want to do every year is read a new Christmas retelling. So if you guys have any recommendations that you've read or seen, let me know, because this is the only one that I know of, and I really enjoyed this. So the next book that I read was Star Daughter by Shweta Thakar, and I did not like this book. I gave this book a 1 star out of 5. The only book that I have given a 1 star aside from A Heart So Fierce and Broken, which is the only book that I have DNF'd this year. So that should give you some idea of truly how much I disliked this book. Now, I picked this book as an add-on to my October Book of the Month pick, and I was really excited for it. Honestly, only because the cover was just absolutely stunning, and the idea of a book about a person who is half star, half human, I was like, that has to be something great, right? To give you a very brief summary of what this book is about, Sheetal is the main character, and she is a 17-year-old half star, half human Indian American girl who lives in New Jersey. And she lives there with her father until something happens where she ends up having to go and find a cure for him, and that ends up leading her to the stars and the Star Castle or whatever that's up there. Like, truly, this book was boring from start to finish, and not just boring but confusing. Like, there were a lot of aspects that I didn't understand, and at first I was worried it was just me, like maybe I'm just not captivated by the story. But then I went on Goodreads and I saw that a lot of people were saying the same things. And for me personally, I actually don't really like when the main characters of books are musicians or artists or anything like that, because usually a lot of the book is just talking about whatever like skill they have, and this book was the worst example of that. Like, truly 80% of this book was just lengthy, overdrawn out descriptions of her music, and I hated it. Like, I am not a musically inclined person. I don't know anything about music other than if it sounds good or bad to me. And so the fact that she was getting so in detail and in depth with all of these different aspects and how it felt to her and how her soul connected with the music, I was just like, girl,
can't relate.
This book suffers in the worst way from the chosen one trope. And for the most part, I don't have a problem with that trope. I feel like I typically can see the reason why the main character is the chosen one. This book, however, gave me the worst version of a chosen one I have ever seen, because Sheetal is literally the most clueless character I have ever read. Like, at no point does she actively try to figure out what's happening. Like, she just lets things happen to her, and she's just like, why? Why is this happening? Oh well, I guess that's what it is. And so we're stuck following her storyline in the same manner at an infuriating pace. It actually took me 4 days to finish this book. 4 days to finish a book that should have been at the most 2 days, because I had so many of the books that I needed to read, and this was only like the 5th one, and I was like halfway there, and I was just like, I need to power through. Like, even the characters were so like terribly written that I didn't connect with any of them. There were way more dislikable characters than likable ones, and typically, at least in any kind of fantasy book, I'm usually rooting for the romance aspect. I did not care, not at any point, not even the slightest bit for this romance. Like, it just felt so boring and contrived, and there was nothing special about it at all. And I was really trying to convince myself that it was maybe a 2. I was like, no, I will never pick up this book again. I will spend the rest of my days hating this book and being disappointed by it. I have to give this a 1. And the ending really was so infuriating, like possibly one of the most actually, I don't know. It is definitely one of the most infuriating parts of this book because it solved nothing. Everything was still up in the air. I thought this book was a standalone. I have no idea if there is going to be a sequel, but it's set up for a sequel, which I hate. And I am so disappointed because I have never been so bamboozled, so tricked, and so deceived by a book like this before. Like, the cover makes you think it's gonna be amazing, and it was just not. So after reading that horribly disappointing book, I was really scared that I was going to fall into a reading slump after, and I couldn't let that happen because I still had like 7 books left to read. So I just had to pick a book that I was very certain that I was going to enjoy. And luckily, just that week, I had received How the King of Elfhame Learned to Hate Stories by Holly Black, and this book was a godsend. I feel like I don't know if it was even that great or if it's because I was so stumped by how horrible Stardaughter was that I was just grasping at anything to make it better. But regardless of the reason, I did enjoy this book and I gave it a 4 stars. Now, this book is very short. It's only 200 pages and it's illustrated, so basically half the book is just pictures. It was fun to read all these stories from Cardan's perspective. I enjoyed them a lot. The only critique that I have for this book is that I wish that there were more stories about Jude and Cardan's relationship. It was more so kind of short stories about Cardan's childhood, what it was like for him growing up, and seeing his side of the story when things were going on in the Folk of the Air series. And there was a little bit of Jude and Cardan in this. Like, there was one storyline that was happening throughout the book with the 2 of them in it, but I wanted kind of more of their relationship dynamic. Like, I wanted to see what their normal lives were like afterwards, after the events of the original series, and I don't feel like I got any of that. The artwork is absolutely stunning. It's so great. It's a style that I'm not very familiar with, that I don't think I've seen in many other books, so I just really appreciated it. And with the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition, at the end you do get to see the art samples from this book when it was being made, as well as Holly's notes on the art pieces and all of that. So it was really cool to get to see all of the behind the scenes for all of this. The next 3 books I definitely didn't think I was going to read this month. I've had them for a little while, mainly as decor, but it was getting close to the end of the month and I really needed short books to read, and pretty much every book that I own is at least 400 to 500 pages, and I just knew that I couldn't read 5 of those books with the short amount of time that I had. So I ended up reading the Bob's Burgers comics. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the comics or the shows or anything like that, but the comics were made for the shows, so really they're only for people who are already fans of the show. Otherwise, I don't think that it'll be interesting to you or the humor will land or anything, because for someone like me who is a huge fan of the show, like truly it's my favorite show of all time, I enjoyed it so much because I already knew their characters and what their motivations were and what their personalities are like. But without that context, I feel like it would just be a mess. Now, I have 3 of the comics. There are 4, I believe, and the one that I didn't get is Pan Fried, which is technically the 3rd comic, and I didn't pick that one up because I actually didn't like the cover of it. And like I said, I originally wanted these as decor. I have a Bob's Burgers themed bathroom where we have like a bunch of puzzles that we put together up on the walls, as well as some figurines that we have and prints that we've collected, all framed up in the bathroom as like a little shrine or something to Bob's Burgers. So originally we bought these to kind of put in the bathroom as well, but they haven't worked their way in there yet. So these are just the 3 that I have, and I read through all of them and I did enjoy them for the most part. The first one, Medium Rare, was by far the best one. I gave this one a 4.5, and then I gave Well Done a 3.5, and the last one, Charbroiled, I actually gave a 3. I didn't enjoy it that much because in comparison to the other 2 books, it actually only really had maybe 3 or 4 stories, and they were just longer stories that actually didn't really interest me that much. Like, they weren't actually stories that were that fun, versus the previous 2 books were actually a whole bunch of different comics done by a whole bunch of different artists and writers, and so you got a taste of a bunch of different styles, and it was really great. I feel like the main draw for these comics for me was the sheer amount of really cool, unique artwork that you get to see in here. I'm glad I finally read them. I've literally had them for maybe like 7 months or something, and they've just been sitting on my bookshelf. This next book I am super excited to share with you guys because I feel like I haven't seen anybody else talk about this book. I'm sure that people have, just not the people that maybe I watch or I've come across, but it is Recipe for a Perfect Wife by Karma Brown. And I originally found this book from TikTok. I saw this video of this woman who was talking about how the cover was distressed to look like a vintage book, and the story was about a housewife from the 1950s and the things that happen. And I literally was like, say less. 1950s housewife, this aesthetic, I love everything about it. I'm just gonna pick it up without knowing anything else, like I do with most books, but especially with this, I was like, I know I'm gonna like this. So I picked it up at Barnes & Noble, and I had it on my shelf for a little while without reading it, and I thought this is the perfect opportunity. This book is only 300 pages, and it'll be a quick and easy read. Now, this story actually follows dual timelines. So one is set in 1950s with a character named Nellie, who is a housewife, and she is married to Richard Murdoch, a man who is 11 years her senior, and the other storyline takes place in current day with a character named Alice, who is married to a man named Nate, and they are actually from New York City, but they have recently moved to the suburbs to start a new life together. Now, there are a lot of parallels between the two characters and their relationships and the problems that they go through, and normally I'm a little iffy with books that have dual timelines because a lot of times I don't feel like it's done super well and I get a little bit confused, or it just doesn't land well with me, but this was done super well in my opinion. Maybe it's because they're kind of closely related in this one, in the sense where Alice is actually moving into the house that Nellie lived in the 1950s. So the story begins when Nellie has already passed and her house is on sale, and Nate and Alice actually buy the house, and that's how their stories connect in the beginning. I definitely really enjoyed seeing the two perspectives of a housewife in the 1950s compared to a housewife in 2018, because the pressures and expectations of society on women back then compared to now are quite different. I mean, there are definitely things that are still expected of women, like to be married at a certain age and to have children and things like that. But compared to the rigid standards of a woman living in the 1950s, where her only job was to be a housewife, to serve her husband, and to literally pop out babies, I think we have it really good now. Both women in this book, as I've said, are housewives, but their situations are vastly different. Nellie is born into a generation and a society where these things are not only expected, but they are enforced. And if you don't follow their rules, there are serious repercussions for them. Versus nowadays, I mean, the divorce rate is like super high, and it's more normalized for couples to figure out their own kind of dynamic. And if the wife wants to work, if the husband wants to work, who wants to raise the babies, things like that. Like, these are all things that are now options and not just an expectation. This book was definitely a little bit slow paced in my opinion, but I still enjoyed it. I don't mind if a book is slow paced if it feels like it's there for a reason, and I definitely did feel like it added to the story, especially in the parts where we were focused on Nellie, because I personally enjoyed her character much more than Alice. I found Alice a little bit irritating in my opinion, which I feel like is kind of unexpected, because Alice, I think, would be the one I would think to relate to more, because she is a current day woman in a current day relationship, but I actually felt a lot more connected to Nellie, and maybe it was just because of her personality, it felt more true to me versus Alice, who unfortunately is the cause of one of the tropes that I hate the most in any kind of book, and it's the miscommunication trope. Pretty much every problem that happens out of her relationship, I'm not saying it's all her fault, but a lot of it is due to the miscommunication between her and her husband and the lies that she outright tells him, and I just cannot stand things like that. So that aspect was just kind of really disappointing to read. Overall though, I definitely gotta say I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 stars out of 5, and I for sure will be rereading this again in the future. Okay everybody, we have now finally reached the last book that I have read for this month and for this year, and it is Circe by Madeline Miller. I have had this book actually since like 2019, and I have been meaning to read it, but it's just been sitting on my shelf, being passed up by all the other books that I keep getting in and that I would rather read. But when it came down to it and I was like, I have one last book to read, what is it gonna be? I thought back to how much I enjoyed A Song of Achilles, and I thought, you know what? I can't go astray with Madeline Miller. I think she's gonna be the queen that leads me into the next year. And yeah, this book I feel a little bit conflicted about. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I definitely thought it was going to be a little bit higher than that because of how much everybody raves about this book. So I felt like it was okay to kind of have high expectations for this book, but sadly it did not live up to what I thought it was going to be. So Circe is about a nymph named Circe who is the daughter of Helios, the god of sun, and a water nymph. And she has never quite fit in with her family. She's always been picked on or bullied or left out. She is constantly being abandoned by people in her life. Like, she means nothing, and it's just the saddest thing. And when she gets older, she finds out that she's actually a witch, or she has the capabilities of a witch. And because of that, and something that she does, Zeus ends up banishing her and exiling her to an island where she's to live there for the rest of her days alone. That ends up actually being the turning point of the story. That's when her life really begins, because she's able to finally get away from the constraints of being in a family where nobody likes her, nobody respects her, nobody wants her there. And as a nymph, she is required to be a subservient being to all of the men and the gods that are above her. Now, just like in A Song of Achilles, there is a trigger warning for rape in this book. It's not as often or as common as in the last book, but this one is definitely more graphic, so I would definitely steer clear if you are triggered by that topic. But yet again, Madeline Miller's writing just absolutely stunned me. I did feel like this book was long, but I think it was done purposefully. Like, Circe has lived through centuries of basically tragedy and sadness and just emotional torture, and we are forced to go through that with her. So I definitely feel like it was done for a reason, and we were made to feel that way, but I didn't particularly enjoy that aspect of it. It did feel just a little bit repetitive in the sense of her just being alone on this island constantly. So for me, I only really got interested in the book when we are at the last 100 or so pages of the story and things start really picking up. Things actually happen in her life that create real change. Just like with the last book, I really cannot tell you how true it holds to the original story and the original character of Circe, but I really respect the fact that Madeline Miller was able to create a raw feeling world where I felt like I was just diving into the pages and I was there with Circe, like standing next to her while everything was happening, because it was so descriptively detailed. I do feel like the reason why I didn't connect with this book as much as A Song of Achilles is because for Circe's life, the vast majority of it, she is alone and she is just suffering and dwells in her heartbreak and her sadness. And because of that, we are stuck dwelling on those same things for so long. And it feels like this poor woman never gets a break. I was a little bit disappointed that this was my last book, only because I needed something obviously quick, because I only had 2 days to read it. I finished this book last night because of the fact that the story felt lengthy and a little bit drawn out. I had to push myself to sit down and read all of it versus a book that I would have genuinely enjoyed and just flown through. So yeah, I'm glad I finally got through it. I've had this book, like I said, for a while, and I'm glad I can say that I've read it. And I still love Madeline Miller's work. I am excited to see whatever she comes out with in the future, but you know, it wasn't the greatest read for me. And I have now officially gone through all 12 of the books that I've read this month, and I did hit my 50 goal mark for my reading challenge of 2020. I have never done a reading challenge before, so this was definitely a learning curve for me. I decided that next year I'll probably set my goal for 75 books for the entire year, just so that I don't push myself. There's a very good chance that I will hit that goal before the year is over, and maybe I'll up it a little bit more if I do, but I just wanted to set a goal that would be reasonable for me, that wouldn't stress me out like this one did. So thank you guys so much for joining me on this journey. I know I've only just started my channel recently, but I appreciate anybody who has been following along with my wrap-ups or vlogs or anything like that. So let's get ready for a new year with new books and even more reading. Woo! I'll see you guys next time. Bye.